Hey guys, and welcome to the Working Money channel. So I saw this tweet a couple of weeks ago from XRP Zen, that's at XRP Zen 2 on Twitter, and it was a great little article that didn't get a lot of traction when it came out. It was released on May 30th, but it really gives us some insight as to what Ripple is doing and how they're progressing regardless of some friction that we've been seeing in the banking sector. Now, we've all heard about the banks that are using Ripple, engaged with the new system, want to use XRapid, want to be able to instantly settle payments cross borders. But there's also the flip side of the coin when we heard about Finality and how a large consortium of banks want to create a system or are in the process of creating a system that could be the XRP killer. I did a video about this a couple of weeks ago, guys. I will link it up here in the corner if you guys want to review that. So it feels like us XRP investors are getting a little bit of a mixed message. Well, guys, I'm going to explain to you why some banks are hugely engaged with Ripple and XRP and how other banks want nothing to do with them. So thanks again at XRP Zen 2 for posting this. Now, let me read you a little bit of this. Midway into 2019, Ripple is broadening its client base in order to boost growth and capture emerging market volumes, according to Marcus Treacher, SVP of Customer Success at the cross-border payment blockchain scale-up. We're targeting both payment companies and banks, says Treacher. We're very much focused on building our bank client base as well as building a base in the fintech world. Despite bursting onto the scene a few years ago with a list of pilot banks, including Santander, PNC Bank, and SEB, Ripple's partners of late have predominantly been emerging markets focused on peer-to-peer international payment companies. So those companies include EuroXim Bank, Senfren, JNFX, FTCS, Ali Bank of Kuwait, TransPay Go, BFC Bahrain, ConnectPay, GMT WorldCom Finance, Olympia Trust Company, Pontual Uzend, and Rendimento, according to the latest press release in January 2019, announcing the company had surpassed 200 customers. But Treacher acknowledges the importance of banks and international payments, admitting that most of the scale-up's traffic goes through bank customers. The solution and future of international payments relies on the duopoly between fintechs and banks, believes Treacher. So, the reason we're hearing that some banks are interested in Ripple and want to be part of RippleNet is because these are mostly tier 2 banks. So tier 2 banks, how they do business is they have to go through a tier 1 bank in order to fulfill their customer requests. And so tier 1 banks, big banks, or what they call money center banks, are the types of banks that will charge smaller banks in order to use their pre-funded Nostro and Vostro accounts around the world in order to make cross-border payments. So we know Ripple is going to be using XRapid and going to be able to ultimately eliminate the need for Nostro and Vostro accounts by leveraging XRP that will be used for sourcing liquidity. We all know that, right? And so these tier 2 banks love this idea because ultimately it will be democratizing cross-border payment solutions in that now tier 2 banks will not have to rely on tier 1 banks in order to get business done. Now, do you guys remember that Recode Decode interview Brad Garlinghouse had with Kara Swisher? Guys, I'll link it in the description. It was from Vox, and I will just kind of give you guys a bit of a synopsis on one of the points that he made in the interview. So Brad Garlinghouse talks about this oligopoly of money center banks, and there's only a handful of them. Citibank is one of them. Citibank made $8 billion last year. Yes, that's 8 billion with a B, from other banks alone. So for example, Citi taxes a bank like Wells Fargo so they can use their infrastructure, their Nostro and Vostro accounts, to be able to send cross-border payments. And there's only a handful of these guys. So Citibank is one of them, Deutsche Bank, JP Morgan. They are the ones around the world that have the most pre-funded liquidity. And so these tier 1 banks obviously see Ripple as a threat, but the tier 2 banks see Ripple as the solution for them to be able to make cross-border payments seamlessly without being gouged by tier 1 banks who are essentially their competition, but also the companies that they're reliant on in order to do business. Sounds like a pretty messed up system, doesn't it? So guys, if you were getting confused with why you're hearing some things about why some banks want to partner up with Ripple and why the banking sector, or parts of the banking sector rather, are still kind of cold on it, that is the reason why. Brad Garlinghouse even did say in this interview that he thinks that those tier 1 banks will be the last ones to jump on on board. Ultimately, if Ripple can bleed the tier 1 banks of all their business by democratizing cross-border payments with the tier 2 banks, this is how the world will see mass adoption. Eventually, it'll end up being if you can't beat them, join them. And there are so many more tier 2 banks around the world than tier 1 banks. Of course, tier 1 banks can decide to do whatever they want. They can continue working with Swift. They can continue using the old model, but RippleNet and using XRP as leverage to fund liquidity cross borders will be the new way of doing business. In other words, XRP the standard, baby. So let's go back here. Marcus Treacher explains the reason we're going after banks and fintechs equally is because the payments landscape is going from a bank-only thing to a much more open industry, and that's exactly what I was talking about, where a great deal of innovation is happening in the pure play payment fintechs. But we very much haven't left the banks. They're still very important as they ultimately carry the bulk of the traffic. We're very much in play with banks, but taking it much wider, he says. So here he's actually talking about fintechs and banks as the play, not just one or the other. It is not as easy to suggest that banks haven't been innovating in the space or the ones responsible for holding back progress, believes Treacher. The banks themselves are moving quickly, much more quickly responding to this change, says Treacher. Unlike legacy providers like Swift, our view is that payments is not the preserve of the banking world, but much broader, and the payment companies we're working with are the most dynamic in the industry. That's where we get ideas and innovation. According to Treacher, change in the payment sector is imminent. And so Marcus Treacher, for those of you guys who do not know, actually, let me finish this quote here. The real shift will be with the exponential growth among the unbanked and financially excluded, says Treacher. You can't support that world with legacy payment flows. So as you can see, he's kind of slamming Swift's legacy payment system. Swift's GPI is a tracking system that relies on banks improving their service level agreements to pay out more quickly because it's more visible, because it is tracked. That's still very centralized and very much a banking network, which is very hard for corporates to use, he says. And so what I was going to say about Marcus Treacher, obviously works for Ripple. Marcus Treacher is the SVP of Customer Success at Ripple. Marcus has over 30 years of experience in transaction banking and payment technology, including 12 years in global leadership roles at HSBC. He served as a member of the global board of Swift from 2010 to 2016, so he has previously worked for Swift. I'm sure knows the ins and outs of that company, how they work, and ultimately how they're falling short. Ultimately, though, guys, according to Treacher, change in the payment sector is imminent. I want to leave it on that note. I'll link all the articles in the description. Guys, I hope you understand a little bit more now the difference between tier 1 and tier 2 banks and why some banks are interested in going with RippleNet full force and others see it as a huge threat that they can ultimately do nothing about. Anyways, that's just my opinion, but I want to hear what you guys think. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Like the video if you like the content I'm providing. I always love hearing your comments. See you in the next one, guys.